الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. I begin in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. May the peace and blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon His final messenger Muhammad and his blessed and purified progeny. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers, dear sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, as mentioned, the subject of the paper, which the title varies depending on what you're looking at, which some of it says loss of tradition, which was the original title. Then the loss of tradition, civilization, the loss of traditional civilization. All in all, speaking of a loss in relation to tradition. A loss and followed by what we've lost. A loss that we all, to varying degrees, recognize. Well, we hope that most people recognize, but at this point, be in the Muslim world, the non-Muslim world, it is recognized that there is a loss or a shift that has taken place, and that there is something wrong with the world that we live in, and what we've learned, and the society in which we interact with one another, and in which we interact with either not people, but the very buildings that we occupy and that we surround and that we work in and that we study in, and even our places of worship. This was evident to me as well in my travels overseas, that this loss wasn't something that was particular, or the feeling of a loss wasn't something that was particularly Muslim, but even those overseas shared the same sentiments. And there are many articles and many books that have been written on the growing dissatisfaction of large segments of the population, of individuals within the world, and disenchantment with the modern world, with the world that is around them, be it in education, be it in the realms of art, in varying realms. And so, where did this all begin? First of all, we have to recognize that what tradition is in the first place. So we have to define a thing before we begin to discuss it. What is referred to here as tradition is a connection to the sacred, a connection to God, who is at the center of all things. To put it in as plain a way as possible. And that is to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the prime and center focus of one's life, and He is the center in which everything is from that center manifests, or everything from that center moves forward or comes into being. And He is the prime focus of the individual in whatever engagement they are engaging in, be it within the realms of art or education or architecture or even politics, and even in how one deals with the environment, how one deals with any science or any field that they are in. What we find is that at some point in history, a shift took place, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala became secondary and the human being became primary. The shift is hard to recognize for most people, meaning most people can recognize that there is a problem, but they cannot identify where it began by virtue of their education. The education system that they are in is one in which it does not describe reality as it is. Meaning, for example, when going over times in which traditional values existed, They are taught that these times and these ages were what they refer to as dark ages or backwards ages. As such, the individual, when wanting to find and identify where the problem began, they would not even consider in the slightest going back. Yes, there is a fascination with things that are old, with things of the past. People visit museums, they go to different places, and they go to visit artifacts, and they visit these sites, and there's a fascination and there's a recognition that there is an innate beauty behind everything that they perceive within these traditional civilizations, be either Muslim or non-Muslim, meaning Muslim civilizations and non-Muslim civilizations. And they realize that these individuals, that they had something within them, and in which everything that they did, there was a beauty that was imbued within that which they pursued. That beauty that is traditionally understood to be a reflection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That even Plato, he says that beauty is the splendor of the truth. Truth with a capital T, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Huwa al-haq. He is Jameel. He is the beauty. Alright. And so the individual, whether they had they didn't have to necessarily be a metaphysician, meaning that wasn't a requirement for them to produce something that had a symbolic truth to it within their buildings, within their artwork, within their teachings. It was all within the realms of, or it can be categorized as sacred teachings, sacred sciences, sacred arts. Whether they have a background in metaphysics or a background in these things or not, by virtue of the nature of that society that existed at that time. Even within the fields of astrology, cosmology, science, you'll find that the natural world itself as well played a role, and there was an understanding of how to interact with the natural world. And there wasn't this destruction of the natural world that later took place. And even in non-Muslim civilizations, when you begin to analyze how they treated the natural world. For example, one scholar always mentions this example of the Chinese and the fact that they discovered gunpowder, but they never went the lengths that we went, long before we began to use it for different applications and the creation of missiles and so on. On top of the fact that many traditional civilizations also had scarcities. They also had issues and with regards to food and with regards to resources. They also had trade, and that trade impacted their expansion and impacted their political endeavors. Yet you never find them go to such brash lengths that we have in the modern age onwards with regards to our, for lack of a better word, our heartless pursuit of desire, in which we cut down everything that is in our way. Meaning we don't mind if we pollute the rivers, if we pollute the sea, so long as we can continue our expansion and continue fulfilling our greed and our want with disregard. You find it even in the works of the scientists today and different analysts, in which they treat the natural world as if it's something that we must conquer. And there's no sacred nature either to the human being or human life or the environment itself. This was evident also during the time of COVID and how human bodies were dealt with, how the crisis was dealt with. The fact that in the British Parliament, they even had a discussion in which human beings' lives were reduced to that of an animal. Where they were talking about whether one should use tax money whether tax money should be wasted on the elderly, considering it is the law of the jungle that the weak die out and the strong remain. This perspective and this approach to human life is fascinating, but it's something that we all recognize. So this problem, we're unable to identify it as a result of what? Primarily our education. This education, what it does is it strips you of this, not to say that don't get an education, don't pursue an education. No, but the principles of your belief. What are they? That world view that you adopt. if God is not part of that worldview that you adopt. If you don't have a traditional worldview, you will not be able to interact with a world in which you can derive meaning from the world around you. This was also done through politics. For example, because I can't take credit for many of these understandings. There were authors that wrote about it and extensively. Kumaraswamy, Titus Burckhardt, in which they identified, for example, in Kumaraswamy's case, that dictators who took on certain ideologies also strived, for example, to strip a people of their traditional understanding through changing, for example, their clothing. This is something that, for example, Burckhardt asserts that the button on the cuff was inserted onto the shirt, the dress shirt, in order to prevent Muslims from doing wudu. You didn't have to outwardly tell him not to pray to a higher being. You just had to create enough obstacles. For example, they said that in one study in the Ottoman Empire, even the shirt buttons, where one would open and close their shirt, was done in a way that they would adhere to the mustahabbat. For example, starting from the right to the left, said that was changed in order for them to detach from their tradition. And another point that he makes is, for example, in the case of Turkey and Iran, one of the similarities between Ataturk and the Shah, not the Shah that was removed, but rather his father, the changing of clothing. This was an intentional act. This was something that was done purposely before legislating certain laws that were in his best interests. They worked really hard on changing the language and changing the clothing. Changing the language so that they don't have access to those sources and those materials, to the clothing, because they realize that the clothing has an impact on the individual. Huge impact on the individual. Meaning the individual that wears clothing that is similar to his neighbor, or clothing that has a certain, that is symbolic in nature. For example, clothing that pushes one to work in a community. If you analyze, for example, Sudan, before al-Bashir was overthrown, and you looked at Omar al-Bashir, and you looked at Omar al-Bashir's prime minister, and Omar al-Bashir's doctor, Omar al-Bashir's neighbor, Omar al-Bashir's school teacher, you can't tell. They all dress the same. They all look the same. They dress in the same dress. The sense of community was there. What they wanted to promote was something that goes against traditional values, which is individualism. And to do so, we had to first eliminate, we don't have to outwardly say these things. We can eliminate those symbols from society. And so they changed and amended the clothing, forcing one to wear a suit, forcing one to wear a hat. In one sense, they realized that this initiatic aspect to art, in that art, be it in the form of clothing or architecture, initiates the individual into a certain truth. And if we can amend it and change it into something that's more personal, something that's more humanistic, something that's more individual, then they would automatically detach, because they would be initiated into falsehood or into a false ideology. Now, the destruction of traditional civilization did not just impact the realm of arts, although it is most evident, and the realm of arts is something that us as Arabs and Muslims, we greatly neglect, which is something that has to be highlighted, even within the Muslim world. This understanding of why things were the way they were, why they built them the way they built them. What is the basis? What is the foundation? Or the initiatic aspect of art is not something that even subject of discussion. It even seeped into our centers of education, be it the seminary or otherwise. Even seminarians themselves cannot identify where they lost track of things. I remember one of my teachers told me that when he began studying physics, they used to teach physics in the seminary, he said there were 30 students. He said when we began teaching metaphysics, he said I was the only one left. Nobody was interested. He said outside of the seminary, there were individuals that were, this was at that time Hujjatiyya, if I remember correctly. He says outside of Hujjatiyya school, which was designed by Allama al-Tabatabai, he said that there were tractors in front of the school. He said there was two men standing outside of it, and he said this summarized for him the core issue. They said, look, see all those turbines? If they put all their minds together, they can't make one tractor, right? And this is the mindset of a lot of people. They don't see the value anymore in these things, or at the very least, they didn't. We can say, Alhamdulillah, in this day and age, people are beginning to recognize they're disenchanted. These promises that were given to humanity during the modern era, that there will be greater unity and greater understanding, and we will reach new heights and new peaks. People believe that because the modern world did offer humanity to some extent or another certain things that we cannot deny. That we did reach the moon. There were great discoveries. That Einstein, everything that he did in his works cannot be neglected. Although I'm not a physicist or a mathematician, but there are others like Wolfgang Smith that would even have a problem with even that statement. Nevertheless, people witnessed firsthand the invention of certain machines that made human life much, much easier. But they didn't recognize the cost. Right now, generations later, we recognize the cost. And in turn, we have a responsibility and a role as Muslims to see what can we do after this recognition. Now that we recognize the problem, first we have to identify where it began. Again, when we say tradition, people generally think of culture, they think of custom. And again, it's neither culture nor custom, nor is it to say that the past was devoid of certain issues. It's not to say that the past or history, or it's calling on people to go back 1,000 years or 1,400 years. Rather, it's to go back onto those traditional principles that guide their life in every field that they are in. Guide how they perceive the world. Guide their understanding of truth. And so the Muslim's role, essentially, to be a Muslim is to be able to return to that center. To return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And not to have this abstract understanding of truth. To be able to derive meaning from the world around them and meaning from their existence, and to be able to be connected at once within themselves and to that which is within themselves and to that which is above themselves. And to have that sense of the sacred within their lives.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Shaykh Ahmad, for that presentation of the paper. Postmodernism is a philosophical reaction to modernism. Modernism was a movement that developed in the European Renaissance when the Enlightenment was initiated, or it was born after people in Europe lived in the dark medieval ages. They were in the age of ignorance, and suddenly they became enlightened. And the philosophy of modernism began to develop. Religion was rejected. Tradition, for those who love that word, was also rejected. And an alternative was beginning to develop. That is to reduce reality to the physical reality. There's no metaphysics, there's no spirituality, there's no reality beyond what we can see and what we can measure. This basically was the core idea of modernism. And it seeped into all the different sciences. You could see it in the works of literature, in the works of art, in the works of science, discoveries, biology, physics, and whatnot. And you can see it in every other aspect, like education, for example. So these ideas began to seep into all our thoughts, into our thought system. And that is in Europe. The rest of the world was busy doing other stuff, while Europe was developing these ideas, eventually leading to the Industrial Revolution, and basically to where we are right now. Postmodernism came as a reaction to that. While modernism says that we have to reach truth through rationality and objectivity, postmodernism came to say that there is no limitation to acquiring truth. In fact, there might not be any truth. This is one of the things that they advocate. That rationality is not the only method where we can reach reality. It's a very limited scope. And I'm going to give a brief introduction and go into detail about what this means. You might hear words that are passed around such as post-structuralism, post-secularism, post-colonialism, right? These are things that we read online that, we pass around without really understanding what they refer to or where they came from. We never had this term mentioned before. What is post-secularism? Are we living in a world that's not secular anymore? Did we pass that stage of secularism? Or did we not even enter secularism? So these are questions that postmodernism has posed. And this is why it's very important for us to be able to understand what these philosophies are, because it's what is the driving force for our thinking as human beings in our Western society. If you study science right now at the college level or university, or even in the schools, the definition of science and how science goes to evaluate certain truths is affected by that philosophy. As I'll show, medicine has been influenced by postmodernism, just as it was influenced by modernism. Education, the idea of narratives, idea of meta-narratives. I'm sure some of you who have read into this know what a meta-narrative is. And living in the time that we're living in right now, where there are wars going on around the world, we see that a lot of people are waking up to certain types of oppression, maybe in a way that was not precedented before. Why are more people aware of certain contexts? If you go back 10 or 15 years ago, it seemed like there was only one group that was concerned with the oppression of a certain type of people. Nowadays, you finally see that there's been a sort of awakening. People that are supporting a cause that you thought was peculiar to a specific culture. Suddenly, people that belong to other cultures and other ways of thinking are supporting that cause because there are people who are oppressed against people who are oppressors. This is another thing that postmodernism brings onto the table, and that is defining things as being related to power structures. So they connect this to meta-narratives, but I'll go into detail about that in a little bit, inshallah. So that was just a brief introduction to the paper. And if I figure out how to open this, I will go into the actual paper. On the phone, they have the option of choosing you can have the back button or you can have what are they called? The swipe? No, the gestures. I put the gestures and I forgot how to use them. So I figured it out right now. All right. So this topic is important because it tells us about the way human thinking has developed. And for us to understand that, we have to be able to educate ourselves. If we're not educated about the underlying factors that shape the human thinking, we will only be reactionaries. If there's something that's flowing, we're going to flow with it, without knowing why we're flowing with this. Our mind changes, our definition of things change, and we don't realize that there's a driving force behind this. There's something that's creating these changes. They're not just happening randomly. But in general, most people are unaware of what causes these changes to happen. So for example, discussions on gender fluidity. How did that come into play? When did human beings decide that gender is a fluid thing? When did human beings decide that everything that we have defined, such as family or political structures or law, are mere constructs of the mind? How did this discussion come into place? Not too long ago, nobody contested that gender is binary. For the longest time, at least the general idea or understanding was like that. Suddenly, a discussion came into play that it's not binary. It's fluid. In fact, we don't only have two genders, but we have as much as a person might want to perceive. So what created this change? What brought this discussion into play in the first place? This is what this paper is trying to do, is to try to explain to us in hopefully the most simple way possible what brought these changes of thought into place. And you can go home, read more about this, educate yourself about this. If you're an educator in school, read about how postmodernist thought has affected your field of study or your field of work. If you're a doctor, read about how postmodernism has reshaped the practice of medicine. If you're a nurse, if you're a lawyer, if you're an engineer, or any field that you are studying, especially literature as well, and even art. Because postmodernism is a movement that did begin in the arts before it began in the sciences. It began where they were reinterpreting art pieces from a personal perspective. Modernism, if you look at their artwork, you would see that there was a specific idea that was being presented. There was an objective idea that was presented in the artwork. Postmodernism rejects the simplicity. They say that we don't want simple artwork. What we're looking for is complexity. What we're looking for is multiple layers of meaning. So modernism was trying to give one layer of meaning in their art, one narrative, one idea. It was very easy to look at a modern artwork and derive a common meaning if multiple people looked at it. And the meanings were not very complex. I don't know if the audience members here go to art museums or not, but if you do go to one, usually they have these modern art museums, or maybe postmodern. They don't call them postmodern as of now. But if you go to them as opposed to the medieval artwork or that what preceded it, you will see that the artworks are very different. Sometimes you can make no sense of them. Just scribbles, and no offense to whoever drew those scribbles, but if postmodernism is correct, then I have the right to call them scribbles because it's a perspective of mine, right? And you might see a lot of meaning in that, but I might just see this, right? So you see that. You see a lot of things related to distorting human figures in the artworks. Different colors. A lot of it is dark as well. But this is what postmodernism tries to do. It tries to add layers and layers and layers of meaning, and then they don't tell you what it means. It's not the objective or the job of the artist to tell you what his artwork means. The artist will just draw something. Sometimes the artist doesn't even know what it means. You know, it's just, this is what came, and now we have to figure out what it is. So you're observing the artwork, and you don't know that the artist is with you observing, trying to figure out what that piece is trying to tell us, right? So this is something that began in art. It seeped into the other disciplines of knowledge as well. And there are a few thinkers who were analyzing postmodernism, and they were predicting that postmodernism is not something that is going to seep into our culture very quickly. They predicted that it might take a few generations, or it might take about 30 years. Now, postmodernist movement began in the 1970s. That's when it was started. We're in 2023 right now, and we're just starting to feel the effects of that thought. So it's not that postmodernism developed and immediately you find an effect or change in the society. This type of change was predicted back then that it will take a number of different generations for it to actually happen or occur or begin to show in our society. And the past few years really tells us that this postmodernist thought has began to enter our thinking, and it's began to reshape the way we view the world. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Okay. So some of the main thinkers that are considered to be the founders of the postmodernist thought are Derrida. He's an Algerian French thinker. And another person is Lyotard. Lyotard wrote about his understanding of what postmodernism is and how the human thought is going to change over time. So these are two important names. Some of you might have heard about them. Some of you maybe not. But if you do jot them down and you go home, read about them. Read about their thoughts. Read about what they were defining. Derrida, he's French, maybe Derrida is how he would like for it to be pronounced. Derrida. And the second one, Lyotard, Lyotard. I hope I pronounced that right. So these are two of the main thinkers. Of course, there are other thinkers as well that talked about postmodernism. They brought about the foundation of that thought. But these are two of the main ones. If you read their works, you kind of get an idea of what postmodernism is. Now, some people try to analyze postmodernism and tell us where it came from. Now, Derrida and Lyotard, or specifically Derrida, they began by writing in the French political newspapers. That's where their writings began. And that French newspaper that they wrote in belonged to the political left in France. So some people have tried to draw the connection between the political situation in Europe and this change of thinking. They think that there's a political agenda behind this philosophical movement. This is one way of analyzing it. And in order to prove that, they say, just look at how this world is moving forward. Look at how postmodernism is affecting the world that we're living in. The effect of postmodernism on medicine. The computerization of medicine. Removing the practice of medicine from having a physician dealing with the patient directly and building a relationship to giving medicine to corporations, making it like large businesses. And we've already started to see these changes. A lot of you who go to certain hospitals see that names of hospitals have begun to change. Now, you don't have a local clinic or local hospital, but this urgent care or clinic belongs to a corporation of medicine. This is part of the postmodernist movement, because postmodernism in reality doesn't believe in any sort of truth. This is one of the main ideas of postmodernism. There's no objectivity. There's no way we can know what the truth is. What we have is a matter of perspective. Every person has their own perspective. I might see reality in one way, and another person might see it in another way. And there's no way for us to prove that my perspective has any more legitimacy than your perspective. Now, how do you prove this philosophically? Well, we're not going to delve into that because it is really complex, because, there's these theories of what language is and how the mind functions and how reason is very limited in the human being. And we can't delve into all of this right now. I'll touch upon this in the paper. If you do end up having a chance to read it, you can read it, or you just go online and read about how postmodernism rejects objectivity and they believe in relativity. So in one sense, they don't believe that there's any truth. This, in the Islamic tradition, is not acceptable. Now, in the Islamic tradition, we do meet with postmodernism in one point, but we depart in other points. In Islam, our philosophers have told us that, yes, reason does have its limitations. So we do agree with postmodernism that we cannot only use reason to reach reality or truth. This is what postmodernists have said is the problem with modernism. Okay. But Islam says that even though that reason is not the only method to reach truth, and it cannot give us all the truth, we can't use our mind to reach reality, only our mind, the human being has other faculties that they can also use to reach truth. And reason is an important faculty in the human being. It allows us to reach truth in certain things. So things that are rational, argumentation. If we remove reason, then we can't make any argument at all. What are you going to argue on the basis of? You can't prove anything, right? If I want to tell you that every human is mortal, right? And Muhammad is a human, therefore Muhammad is mortal, right? This is classical logic. This is a proposition. Postmodernism says that we can't really prove this. What is to be mortal? What is to be human? And what is this understanding? This is only your way of understanding reality, because throughout history, our cultures and our societies shaped our language and shaped our way of thinking, and we've just inherited that. We've inherited the idea that humans are mortal. Our definition of human has been affected by how our ancestors and civilizations have defined them. And this is where they come to reject the idea of meta-narratives. Has anyone here heard of meta-narratives? Are you aware of what they are? The brother here. Well, meta-narratives, according to postmodernists, are the stories that civilizations, usually the ones with power, use to interpret the reality. And they connect meta-narratives with power structures. So, for example, the idea of the clash of civilizations, that's a meta-narrative. The theory of clash of civilizations explains or tries to explain how civilizations develop over time. So it gives us one narrative to explain the whole story of what's going on in the world. The Enlightenment is a meta-narrative. That humans were in the dark ages, and suddenly they've woken up, they've become enlightened. This is to explain what happened in the human history. We were in the dark, and now we've become enlightened. The idea of the New World, when Columbus came to the USA, that's a meta-narrative. What happened? How did the US start? Well, there was a new world. Columbus came with his people, they met the natives, and they introduced this beautiful country called the US that allowed for the people to live their dream and in freedom and so on and so forth. So the New World is a meta-narrative. It tries to explain what happened in a certain geography or point in history by giving this grand picture and basically interpreting the events that happened. So when we go to school and we read or study about Columbus and their move to the US, we think it's a wonderful thing. At least in the past we did, right? We were told that this is where we came from and this is what brought the country to place. And basically what it does, it glosses over the oppression of others. So what postmodernism says is that those people in power, they tend to use meta-narratives to justify their oppression of those who are weak or those who are in the minority or less than them. And this is one problem with modernism. It always tends to justify the oppression of the stronger and larger groups at the expense of the smaller groups. So, for example, if you ask a Native American what happened when Columbus came, they would have a very different narrative than what the Europeans have presented to us, right? A very different picture of what occurred. So postmodernism says that this giving this meta-narrative, this oversimplicity of things to justify your taking of other people's lands is a big problem. Let us ask what the natives think about this. They have a perspective, and their idea and their culture is just as legitimate as yours is. So postmodernism focuses on the multiplicity of narratives. There's no one grand narrative. And this is why they reject meta-narratives. When it comes to the issue of the Middle East right now, to take a live example, the idea that a certain group of people were oppressed and they were given a piece of land in order for them to live in protection and dignity, and so on and so forth. To postmodernists, this is a meta-narrative. It seeks to justify a certain action of a political or power group at the expense of those who are weaker than them. It's a colonial movement, according to the postmodernist thought. And that's why you find a lot of people now, especially the younger generations who have been exposed to the ideas of postmodernism, rejecting meta-narratives, rejecting structural, living in the time of post-structuralism. They tend to support these minorities or these oppressed groups, and they tend to reject these meta-narratives that the stronger powers and governments use to justify their taking over of lands and their destruction of societies and of culture. So this is one reason why you find that there's a lot of movement, especially in the younger generations. You know, the older people try to, criticize them or put them down by calling them like the TikTok generation or things of that sort, just to kind of discredit what they're doing. But they're waking up to the oppression of other people. That, wait a second, these guys also have a narrative. Let's ask them how they feel about this. Why should I force the idea of the colonialist and how they feel, or and accept that as the narrative that is true? Why don't I ask the people who are being colonialized? What if they don't like this? What if they reject it? Why should I reject their opinion and not give it any credit or any importance? So this is another aspect of postmodernism that we can feel is becoming or beginning to influence the way we think. And from what I just described, it seems like it's a very positive thing, right? It's a rejection of power structures, rejection of meta-narratives, and the rejection or the allowance of those who are oppressed and minorities to speak out and to give them a voice that's just as valid as the voice of the one in power. So movements in the US, for example, like BLM and other movements are beginning to be given more attention and more care, right? This is something that is a very modern or recent phenomena. Again, it goes back to this idea of postmodernism, that these people have the right to tell us how they view history as. How did they develop? I don't need someone who belongs to the white group, let's say, to tell me how black history developed in the USA. I need a black person, an African American, to come and tell me what their perspective is. Hispanics in the USA, how do you feel about your presence over here? How do you feel about migration? How do you feel about the political parties in the USA? I don't have to come, or I should not come, and try to give an interpretation of events that includes other minorities or other groups without caring about what their opinion is. So this is the struggle that we're going through right now. There are people that are trying to push this postmodernist thought, and there are people who are trying to reject it. And usually the ones who try to reject it are the ones who are in power. This is according to what the postmodernist thinkers believe. Now, religiously or through religious thought, what do we accept and what do we reject? Is it either postmodernism or modernism, or do we have alternative ways of thinking, right? If we really want to believe in postmodernism, then we cannot limit, and this is one of the critiques of postmodernism, is that we cannot limit truth even to postmodernism. And this is where it starts to become a bit complicated. You know, the theory kind of criticizes its own self. I'm not going to delve into that because it seems like the time is almost over. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.